So, we've been talking about Jesus and all the roles that he fulfills in our spiritual journey and why we need them. And so, in this video, I want to talk about Jesus as King. Now, you might be thinking, how could I possibly need a king, and what does this have to do with my spiritual journey? Isn't a monarchy totally outdated? Well, just like the other roles that we looked at, I want to look at how Jesus fulfills this role as we see in the Old Testament. Now, a lot of people have taught that God never intended for Israel to have a king, and he simply gave into their demands for one. And this is actually not true. In fact, many years before Israel ever anointed a king, God actually gave them qualifications for what their future king should look like. And we see this in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And this is what God says in Deuteronomy 17. He says, when you make it to the promised land, when you go in and you take it, and you possess the land, and you say, we want a king like all the other nations, here's the kind of king that you should choose. And God lists these three main qualifications that this king should fulfill. And the three qualifications are this. First of all, the king needs to be one of them. He needs to be an Israelite, not a foreigner. Number two is that the king needs to not hoard things for himself. So, not horses, not wives, not silver and gold. And the third thing is that he was supposed to write out a copy of the law of God. And he was supposed to read it day after day, memorize it, and live it out, obey it, and be an example to the rest of the people of Israel. Did Jesus actually fulfill all of these qualifications for God's chosen king? Absolutely. First, he was born an Israelite. Second, he didn't use his power to make a name for himself. Instead, he made himself nothing, becoming like a servant. And third, he walked humbly in obedience to God's laws, even to the point of death. So even though he may not have looked like a king, he actually fulfilled the role of God's chosen king perfectly. But what does this have to do with our faith here and now? Well, if you remember from the video about Jesus as judge, the people of Israel kept falling into sin and needing to be saved. And each time, God would raise up a judge in order to push back their enemies and restore peace and freedom. Well, each time this happened, a judge from Israel would either be encouraged to assume the role of king or would try to make claim to that role themselves. And we see this in the story of Gideon, Tola, Jair, and Jephthah. And the problem is that each time one of these kings assumed that role, they weren't really all that different from the kings and the nations around them. And Israel would find themselves right back in the same position as they were before. And this is exactly what happens in our own Christian faith. After we experience the peace and the freedom that comes when God raises up Jesus the judge to push back the enemies, the oppressive enemies of our hearts, we look to set up a new king. And sometimes the king that we choose is ourselves. We want to be our own king. Or sometimes we choose somebody or something else. And we can manage for a little while, but in time we realize that the new king is just as corrupt as the old oppressive one was. So without Jesus as king, holy, set apart, incorruptible, we're stuck in this cycle of sin, corruption, and oppression, and we have no chance to continue long in the kingdom, to use the words of Deuteronomy 17. So as we approach Easter, may we remember Jesus the King, holy and set apart from all other kings, humble, faithful, obedient, incorruptible, establishing an everlasting kingdom, free from oppression, enduring into eternity, breaking the cycle of sin and oppression in our lives.